Parents Defending Education recently released new polling on Title IX policies and gender identity activism in schools. The findings come after the Biden administration recently expanded Title IX regulations to apply to gender identity rather than just biological sex. Joining us now to talk about this issue is Parents Defending Education Director of Outreach, Erika Sanzi. Erika, thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about this new polling. When it comes to Title IX policies, as just one example, some polling shows 62% of voters believed gender identity activists were going, quote, too far with proposed changes, compared to 10% who say they're not going far enough. Why do these findings concern you?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say they concern me as much as they corroborate what it is that we're hearing on the ground. So the 62% of parents being concerned, voters, that this was a poll of voters being concerned. Actually, that number seemed a little bit low to me, but it makes more sense now that also our polling revealed that that 81% of voters polled have not even heard about these Title IX changes yet. And so when we laid out some of those changes in the polling, some of those numbers were much, much higher in terms of what voters are comfortable with and or approve of or don't approve of.
Yeah, and Title IX, for those who aren't familiar, was passed 50 years ago to establish and preserve women's equality in education institutions. The Biden administration proposed a new rule to rewrite that Title IX, expanding regulations to gender identity rather than biological sex. What does that really mean for women and girls in sports? Because that's become a big part of this debate as well.
Yeah, and that actually is the stuff that we see that's the most unpopular has to do with women and girls in sports and also in locker room and changing room facilities. So under the rewrite of Title IX that the Biden administration has proposed, all decisions about athletics would be based on gender identity. And that would mean that biological males who have gone through puberty would be able to compete against girls and women in athletics. It would also mean that they would have full access to the locker rooms and the changing rooms and the restrooms. And that, again, the girls would have really no recourse because they would be required to accept that as a condition of being on those teams.
But there is a lot of pushback from both sides. I mean, you do have people who are saying this is necessary to make sure that people and their feelings, their desires, what they believe they identify as needs to be respected. So is this a gray area? I mean, it'd be difficult to define a perfect line, wouldn't it?
I don't think it's as difficult as people are making it out to be. I do agree with you that what we have right now is there's a tension, and the tension is sort of between what we would call respect and inclusion versus fairness and safety. And so it is clearly unfair, and the polling seems to play this out. We saw numbers of over 70% of voters, especially Hispanic voters, their numbers were the highest on this, being opposed to biological males being allowed to compete against girls and women in athletics and also being able to use their locker rooms. So again, are we willing to compromise fairness and safety in the name of respect and inclusion? I think the answer to that has to be no. So we're going to have to find another solution to this because, you know, Title IX was always defined by and determined by biological sex. And this shift is going to really, really create a lot of problems. And really, you know, in my opinion, it's really a rejection of fairness that we just can't let stand.
Well, let me ask you, I've got just under a minute here. The court decision in Bostock versus Clayton County, which held that employees cannot be discriminated against in workplaces because they are gay or transgender, to guide its approach to LGBTQ rights in education settings. Why is this decision being applied to schools?
Yeah, that's a good question. That case was really about employment, and it had to do with not being allowed to fire people based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity. It's really hard to see what that case has to do with what we're talking about, which would be, again, first of all, we're talking about minors. We're not talking about adults in the workplace, but also we're talking about allowing, again, people to use restrooms, changing facilities, even sleeping accommodations on field trips, and also athletic competition, that would all be based on gender identity. And that's really just a totally separate issue from employment discrimination.
All right, still a lot to play out both on the courts and in the court of public opinion. Erika Sanzi, thanks so much for joining us here on the National Desk.
Thanks for having me.